Here in the West, it's the depths of winter and anglers don't have a lot of open water options, but we do have one, and that's tailwaters, and we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast, brought to us by fine folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado, ready and willing to take care of all of your Toyota needs, and of course, Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. They will ship direct to your store. Here it is, guys, very end of January. It's cold out, blustery, yucky, not ideal conditions right now, and we got some snow coming into the western half of my state here in Colorado, another round of snow, I should say, and it's been kind of cold. It's funny because our winter got off to a really, really slow start, and then right about Christmas, all of a sudden it got winter, and it's been winter ever since. But it is going to be warm this weekend before the next round of snow. And that's going to provide an opportunity for some open water fishing for guys that really like to take advantage of it. And that's going to be our tailwaters. And there's a whole bunch of them around my state. Some of my favorites could be anywhere from 11 Mile Canyon to below Pueblo Reservoir to Cheeseman Canyon, where I cut my teeth fly fishing as a teenager. I learned all about drifting nymphs there back in the day, and we could be talking about below Estes Park. We could be talking about the Frying Pan River. There's just a whole bunch of them around Colorado, and I know there's a bunch more in Wyoming. There's a bunch more in Utah. So wherever you might be listening, I'm sure you have some access here in the Western United States potentially to a tailwater, or perhaps you're traveling. And I will say this, speaking of traveling real quick, tailwater fishing in the wintertime, it can be crowded, but it's nothing like summertime. So if you're thinking about visiting Colorado to, say, go skiing, you might pack some fly fishing gear and or some fishing gear, I should say. We're going to talk about that on this podcast specifically. Pack some fishing gear and do a little fishing while you're here. Someplace like below Dillon Reservoir in Silverthorne, Colorado, puts you right smack dab in the middle of skiing nirvana as far as Colorado goes, and you've got the river running right through the middle of town right there. It's a Mysis Shrimp River. It's a fantastic river. And I kind of messed up there a minute ago when I said pack your fly fishing tackle, because statistically speaking, when it comes to winter tailwaters, most of you are going to fly fish. And I don't have hard data to back that up, but I have 20 years or 25 years of traveling around Colorado as a professional, 20 years as a professional, and I've been doing it since I was a teenager. And you'll see most people will be fly fishing, and that's a very common thing. But that doesn't mean that's all you can do. And I think there's some misconceptions that because it's the middle of winter time, you really need a fly rod. And I'll be the first to admit that they're biting little tiny stuff. I mean, little tiny stuff. We filmed a TV show in 11 Mile Canyon one time in February, and we were doing it with fly tackle. And I think the biggest fly we tied on, the biggest one that day, was like an 18, and they went down from there. I did another show with Kirk's Fly Shop in Estes Park on the tailwater there below Lake Mary, and I think the biggest we tied on that day was like a 22. I mean, some of the flies get ridiculously small, and I have nothing against that. It's just not my jam. I've done enough of it to know what it is. I've been doing it since I was a kid. Learned to do it before there was such a thing as a strike indicator, and had to do it old school, where you just kind of had to know that you were bit, for lack of a better way to put it. You either had to sense it, feel it, whatever. These days everyone does it with a fly, with a strike indicator or bubble, whatever you want to call it, and it's not nearly as difficult as it was. But having said all of that, you can definitely get after them with a spinning rod. And the reason I want to bring that up is there's a whole bunch of people probably more qualified to talk to you about winter fly fishing than me. And because I don't do it so much, like I just said, I'm not a big fan of the tiny, tiny flies. I can't see them. I can't feel them. I have Raynaud's disease, so my fingers are very, very numb in the winter. I can't even tie them on. So I have some physical limitations that make that more difficult for me, for one. And then for two, I love to fly fish. It's one of my absolute favorite things to do, but I'm not a huge fan of drifting a nymph rig under a bobber or Euro nymphing or whatever you want to call it, all those different things, mostly because I don't enjoy that kind of fly casting. It's the same reason I don't throw full sinking lines, because for me, if I need a full sinking line, just give me a spinning rod and I'll go ahead and catch some fish. Same thing with the bobber rig on the fly tackle. It's just not my favorite thing. For me, a fly fishing is all about fly casting. I love the feel of a fly cast, which is why I either throw streamers or wet flies or dry flies almost exclusively if I'm going to fly fish. Otherwise, I'll take a spinning rod. And that's a little bit counterintuitive when you start talking about something like winter fly fishing or winter tailwater fishing, because of the sheer size of the bugs that the trout are eating. And there's one giant caveat. They're eating those bugs because that's what's available to them. And if they had more things available to them, they would eat those things. And I can tell you that because I've witnessed it in action, where I watched a trout that was apparently not even alive. It was moving so little and just sitting there, and it was below actually Lake Mary's up in Estes, and we watched this fish and he was just sitting there, and I determined he wasn't feeding at all. And then out of the blue, a little tiny minnow showed up in the shallow water along the edge where the seam had kept it open, and that trout darted out and ran that thing down quickly. And that minnow was all of about, 2 inches long, meaning plenty big enough for me to match that with a spinning rod. And then for two, the other thing I'll throw out there about the spinning tackle in the winter, same thing I say all the time. Just because it's cold and they're eating small things, I'm not a match the hatch guy a lot of the time. So really the big problem with the winter fly fishing is that the water is crystal clear and typically extremely low. And so you don't have a lot of water column to work with, and it's very easy to spook fish. And those are the things you really got to be most careful with a spinning rod. So the first thing I'm going to say is light rods. You're going to need light spinning rods for this, light or ultralight, first and foremost. And second of all, I'm going to recommend that rod be as long as you can comfortably handle. And the reason that's the case is that's a softer rod, a little easier to cast lightweight things with, and a light or an ultralight power will be designed to throw in the smaller end of the spectrum that we're going to go with. So I'm going to throw a couple key things out that are how I would approach a spinning tackle situation on any one of the tailwaters that I've mentioned. And again, you keep in mind at all times, the water is almost always crystal clear and extremely low, and it's typically going to be somewhere between about 38 and 40 degrees, particularly on the bottom release dams. So it's warm enough that the fish can move around in it. It's not really, really cold, and trout do fine in that water temperature. So let's talk about it. First and foremost, for me, it's almost always a small jig that comes into play. And when I say a small jig, it could be a little tiny marabou jig. It could be a little tube jig. It could be some sort of a little tiny little curltail jig, or a little imitator of some sort, like a little crayfish imitator, which I've done really well with. In a lot of cases, keep in mind, you can't legally throw anything that's scented or salted. So all the power bait stuff that you normally hear me talk about, little Berkeley power nymphs, are a fantastic choice in tailwater situations in the winter on something like a 16th ounce or even smaller jig head, but they're not legal in a lot of tailwaters because they're scented. So you have to keep that in mind. So you'll hear me mention things I don't normally mention, but there's a whole variety of little 1-inch minnows available, little tiny tube jigs available that are unscented, that are somewhere, say, 1 inch to 2 inches long. Typically slender is better as well, as opposed to a big fat tube in the wintertime. And then crappie jigs. Go to the panfish aisle, and there's all sorts of little, 32nd and 16th ounce little marabou jigs. And if I'm picking one, particularly where my scent and salt is not legal, I'm probably going with the marabou jig, because the marabou jig is a ton of subtle action in very cold water, whereas any sort of plastic or gulp, even if it's legal, gets firmer in the cold water. The marabou, which is a very, very soft feather, if you're not familiar with it, a very soft feather, moves very well in the cold water. Along those same lines, either flies or jigs tied with squirrel hair or rabbit fur, little strips of that, in any sort of combination can be a really good choice as well. And again, it comes down to subtle movement in cold water. The other thing to keep in mind about tailwater situations is a lot of times the water is not particularly fast. So the fish are going to get a chance to look at stuff, and the very subtle action can help you out with that. Another thing I'll look for, let's say I am going to throw something like a little tube jig, which is probably my second choice in the winter behind the marabou or the little hair jig. A tube jig in a translucent color will help you a bunch. So I throw a couple tailwaters. I know I can throw little atomic tubes, and they make them in a clear green and a clear root beer color where you can see through it. It's just got a hint of color. Great choices. And again, it's the clear water and the fish getting a chance to look at it. And anytime you have that scenario, it doesn't matter if it's hot water, cold water, snook or trout, translucent's really good in clear water if fish get a chance to observe what's going on. So that's where I'll generally head for as far as it goes. I generally in the wintertime will avoid the really bright colors. I may throw some sort of an egg type color, like a red or maybe a peachy color or something like that, because we'll get some rainbows at that. Particularly February is headed into March. You're still in a tailwater situation, but you've got some rainbows around that are thinking spawn. You got browns that are knowing that they're gonna, and so that opportunity comes to play as well. But regardless of whatever little jig it is, there's a couple things to it that have made a big difference for me and have really paid off in terms of big fish, particularly just average fish. And one of those is bottom contact. I don't know that I can tell you why, but more than any other time of year, trout that we can access in tailwater situations love a bait that's making contact with the bottom. And some of the biggest trout I've caught in tailwaters were caught in the winter, but in all cases it's been with my jig touching the bottom. So that's an important thing. And what I mean by that is I'll lift it just enough with the rod tip to get the current to push it a little bit at a time and kind of keep it moving, or even literally just drag it on the bottom if I can get away with it. If it's not too snaggy, I will just drag it on the bottom. And I did a TV show about 6 or 7 years ago up on the Frying Pan River, which is a tailwater below Root Eye Reservoir. And we caught some big old trout. And the key there, once I figured it out, was as long as I drug my jig on the bottom, I could catch them with a whole variety of jigs. And you could literally see the fish, watch it as it's dragging it, just dragging it across the sand bottom. It's a smooth sand bottom. Those fish are eating straight mysis shrimp, which are about a tenth the size, if that, of the jig that I'm throwing. But a soft little marabou jig that's dragging on the bottom and puffing up mud was just the trigger we needed. And I could literally get them to bite at will. I could literally drag it across in front of one of the fish that you could see. As long as it stayed on the bottom, they would either follow it or pick it up right away. And I had a bunch of them that followed it all the way to my feet and then short lined me because they're running out of space on it. And I'm just barely dragging it. I'm not talking about, snapping it or winding it in. I'm talking about just barely dragging it on the bottom. And one of the keys to keeping that bottom content, guys, is thin line of all kinds. So for me, the thinnest line I could get is going to be important because it has the least amount of resistance in the water. So it's a braided line thing 100% all the time for me. And these days that's going to be X9 braid in something like 4 or 6 pound, which is very, very thin. And then it's going to have a leader tied to it that's going to be for sure 4 or maybe 6 on the outside, but most likely going to be 4. And that's pretty light. For me, that's pretty light. And I'm going to match that with an ultralight or a light powered rod, depending on exactly what river I'm in. And why I say what river is the smaller the river, the shallower the water, the smaller my stuff needs to be. It has nothing to do with the size of the fish. It has to do with the size of the river and how much water column I have to work with. So that's something I'll keep track of all the time. So if I'm in a bigger river with more room to work, a little bit deeper water, a little bit more width to work with, then I'll step my baits up a little bit, and then I'll step my rods up a little bit. And if I'm in a little tiny river, Like I said, maybe something in Estes Park there where it's little tiny Big Thompson coming out and just barely any water, then I want to be as small and subtle as possible. So the super thin line, these days a Berkley forward line would be a great choice. I'll be dead honest with you. I haven't done it in the winter yet, but I've thrown it in open water and that stuff is extremely thin and it sinks, which would be really good for not lining fish, because even thin braid on the surface in crystal clear water can spook some fish, particularly if they're getting a lot of pressure. And so that Berkley forward sinks. So it's a braid that'll cut the surface film. It's one of the only braids that sinks, and it'll cut the surface film and be underwater, and therefore you don't have that distinct shadow of the surface film going over the top of the fish. So that would be a really good choice as well. And this is also the scenario where like I said, the leader will typically have a loop knot for the most subtle amount of action on that jig on the other end of it, and you're going to see me work the rod the least amount in the winter ever, as opposed to any other time of year. So it's really more about barely making that jig move than anything else. And in a lot of scenarios the rest of the year, I'll snap jig it or swim it or swing it or do all kinds of stuff. But in the winter, most of that goes out the window. I need to throw it above the fish and work it across the current as tight to the bottom or on the bottom and come in at a 45-degree angle to their peripheral vision. If I do that, I catch a lot of fish. And the peripheral vision is key in a lot of scenarios for fish in running water, and it's no different in the winter. And keep in mind, they get the best view of anything in wintertime. So that's a key thing. So everything I do in the winter is just more subtle. The line's thinner, the leaders are thinner, the jigs are smaller, and they're tighter to the bottom and with less erraticness or anything like that. And if I put all those things together, I catch fish. Another thing in the winter is I like to stay out of the water if I possibly can. Part of that's because I'm a wussy and I don't like cold water. I don't like cold in general. Part of that, and the biggest part, is because you put off pressure waves in the water and they will know you're there. And sneaking up on fish is a hallmark of good anglers in general. So if I can stay on the bank and get control and still, control my jig from the bank and make throws far enough to get what I need done, then that's what I'm going to do. And that will keep you from spooking fish and stirring up the bottom and all kinds of other things like that. But it'll also keep you warm, and that's important. And one of the key things along those same lines that I like about spinning tackle over fly tackle in the wintertime is I don't have to get my hands wet, whereas with a fly rod, you're stripping fly line and your hands are going to get wet, no doubt about it. So I like that aspect of the spinning tackle as well. But a lot of it is I can just stay on the bank. And I mentioned early on a long rod. A long rod gives you controllability, and it gives you a long casting distance with a lighter bait, and it gives you a big giant shock absorber when you do hook fish. So that can be important as well, because we're dealing with, again, very light lines and leaders. And therefore a big shock absorber is a great choice for landing some fish. And for the record, I caught fish on a 6-pound leader in the frying pan, 6-pound braid, 6-pound leader, up to about 6 or 7 pounds without a whole bunch of problem. I never broke anybody off, but it's a very soft rod that I'm throwing in that scenario to keep those fish pinned. So that's a really good choice. Now, so to sum that up, the little jig's the number one thing. With other traditional presentations, there's a couple other things that I have had work for me. A little small hard plug like a number 3 hit stick and swimming it on really heavy overcast, low light days where the trout will feed well, which those are my preference, just for the record, is the overcast days. The high bright sun are beautiful to be on the water, but they aren't always the best time to catch trout. And those low pressure, overcast, low ceilings type days that we get, then you can sometimes get away with swimming something. But even then, I'm probably going to put a swimming tail, like a 2-inch small swim bait, and just retrieve that, because I have a single hook for 1. I don't really have to fundamentally change anything else up for 2. So that's most likely what I'll do. But every now and then I'll throw a small hard plug and get a few bites with that. Now, more commonly than the small hard plug, to change it up completely, is something we played with a bunch. And you talk about getting all kinds of comments. We took a ultralight spinning rod, tied it to a thingamabobber, which is a version of a bobber that a fly guy uses. Tied the braid straight to the thingamabobber, and then also tied off from there the long leader. And then underneath that leader, I put a couple of flies that were weighted, including one very small fly like I would use for fly fishing. The reason I did that is you can literally duplicate drifting a fly under a strike indicator with a long, thin spinning rod, very easily doing that. And what I figured out right away is it's extremely effective. So, because with the long spinning rod, there's just enough weight on it that I could make a throw all the way across the river. And we did this in 11-mile canyon. We get a ridiculous amount of fishing pressure, but I don't have to worry about getting a drag-free drift because that thin braided line I was talking about doesn't drag nearly like quote-unquote spaghetti string fly line does. It cuts the water much better, and that little strike indicator or bobber in this case, because it's on a spinning rod, I can throw between that, the weight of that and the couple of fly rigs, it's enough that I can throw it across the river, and you get really clean drifts doing that, and you get good control all the way around. It has all the other advantages that spinning rod has, but the biggest one being I can continuously get a clean drift and not have to worry about mends and doing all those things that can spook fish. I can throw it, keep the rod tip high, keep as much line out of the water as possible, and just let it drift, and it works exceptionally well. So if you want to basically mimic fly fishing, my recommendation is a 7 or 8 foot spinning rod in a ultralight and very light braid, maybe 4-pound braid, and go down to your strike indicator from there, and then drop a rig off on fluorocarbon below that. That's the other thing I'll throw out there. We almost always use fluorocarbon. Let me rephrase that. We always use fluorocarbon in the winter because it sinks, like I've already talked about. B, it's got the same light refraction characteristics of water, so the fish can't see it as easily underwater. And it's abrasion resistant because we're potentially dealing with some big trout, as I've already mentioned. Regardless of what you think about trout, they do have big teeth, and if they get that little jig down in their gullet, you can, inside their mouth enough where their teeth are on the leader, abrasion resistance can be a thing, and the fluorocarbon gives you a little bit better resistance there. And the fact, like I said, that it sinks, it'll help you pull the small bugs underwater quicker. So there's lots of advantages to the fluorocarbon leader, and like I said, it's going to be somewhere around 4 pounds. The other thing I'll throw out, this is site-intensive fishing, very site-intensive fishing, and you're going to have a bunch of glare typically from snow that's around as well. So this is where my Costas really pay off, and when I'm going winter fishing, I will bring multiple pairs in multiple colors of lenses, which I do generally anyway, but I especially do in winter because I know I'm going to be looking specifically at fish, or I'm going to be looking at fish in slow water that may be deep, that are hard to pick up, and I'm going to be cutting glare like crazy from the snow. So a good quality pair of sunglasses is very important in the winter, probably more than any other time for trout fishing. In terms of the visual aspect anyway. We don't even need to talk about the safety issue and UV protection for your eyes and hooks in the eyes and all those things, just from spotting stuff. And also safety in wading. If you are going to wade, it gives you a better view of the bottom. So for me, Costa's green mirror lens, very, very important in 580 in the glass lens, in the 580 frame or model of glass, I should say. Very great lens. So the green mirror in 580G is fantastic. If it's low light, like the days I mentioned where I might get more aggressive and throw a little bit more aggressive plugs and things like that, then I'll typically go to the Sunrise Silver, which is more of a pure amber base, a little bit brighter colored lens, and those will help you a lot with seeing what's going on. It's probably, like I said, the most important time for your glasses. So the tailwater situations can be just really good in a lot of ways, and the keys to it really are just stealth and finesse and patience and things like that. If you can go out on the really yucky days, that's the days you're going to do well, with the one caveat of wind. Wind makes controllability an issue when you're talking about, well, fly rod either, but also ultralight or light gear. And the more wind you get, the harder it is to control everything. Conversely, you should be able to fish more aggressively, but not that much more aggressively. So the only thing I ask is, or that I strive for, is calm days. It could be heavy overcast, and if it's high bright sun, then I know my work might be cut out for me. So as much as I'm a cold weather sissy, I still love to get out and visit open water, right? The tug is the drug. We got to do it. And my home lake's frozen enough that you can't fish it, and it's not legal to ice fish it, and I don't ice fish. So my option is tailwaters, and I take advantage of them. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. If you want to join the conversation on our social media, that would be fantastic. That's at Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, and particularly the YouTube channel. Hopefully you're listening there as well. Those are all at Fishful Thinker. And also, you can follow my personal pages at Live in LaChance or Flavor LaChance. Flavor LaChance is all cooking. If you happen to be into cooking, we're just getting that one rolling. And Live in LaChance is more of a lifestyle, not just the fishing stuff. So it's all the deer and everything else that I do. So you can check those out if you'd really like to follow along as well. So I appreciate you guys listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.